So I don't want to say yes right here and then we're constrained to this. I want to make sure that if we want to put in the UV protection instead of the chlorine gas, that we can do that.
One thing I'd like to say is why we really like to look at a project and define what's going to be in it. Because some of these things, if we know they're not going to be included as part of what we're planning to build this year, we don't have to go into that, finish our final design. We can include everything that's needed for that at a more preliminary design level and, not have to do the final design at this time. So while still planning to do alternative two, but if you know up front that right now we don't want to look at just for a unit process, say the new raw water lift station, we can block that out, know what we have to do for getting power to it, piping to it, but not do the final detailed design on that component and not have to charge for that. And that's why it's really good if we can, for the contract for looking at that, is define a scope in a little more detail than what we're at now, but with the intent of designing for alternative two and alternative 2B, if we're, recall that's the one where we keep the park. And then, some of these unit processes look at, do we take those to final design at this time? Because one thing about this field, some things, technologies do change and there's improvements. And the last thing you want to do is design something now that is then obsolete in 10 years when it's time to really build it. But if we have planned for that to go in, then it's very easy to do the final design at that time for that component. And since if you're looking at this starting out without having full or an increase in capacity, and you really want to address we can work out what issues need to be addressed and come up with a scope for that number.
So two basically is the expansion with the filters, all the new filters and whatnot.
Two is everything to get you your full capacity and to meet the future limits.
And all the nitrogen, phosphorus.
All the nitrogen, phosphorus, everything that's coming up.
Thank you for that clarification. 2.5B. B includes saves the Veterans Park.
Correct.
Okay. Alderman Cadella.
I'm a little concerned. I would be really afraid to attach any not to exceed number to this. I don't want anybody up here to misunderstand, or maybe I'm the one misunderstanding. To ask you to engineer for option 2, but to say we're only going to spend as much as option 5 may be incorrect, because option 5 isn't really on the table if we're going to engineer for option 2. Some components, some structures need to be included, need to be built at the time of the renovation to house future processes. So 13.4 might not be the number that it takes to get us to a new level of operation, even with minimum or no capacity expansion. And even with minimum or no new discharge standards capacity. I mean, does that sound about right? That 13.4 is no longer a likely number if we have to include some of the other structures to ultimately make option 2 work, even if we don't think about it for 15 more years.
That is correct.
Okay.
For the engineering, for now, until we really get a scope defined, if you look at a not to exceed number of what's on for alternative 2, and then we'll work out the scope of just what you need to have, want to have done, narrow it down. That's the highest it could be. And then we can negotiate.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do tonight is do a concept and direction. So we'll call it 2.4B and we'll drop the number. 2.5B, sorry. Is everybody clear what that means? Design for 2, currently build for 5, save the Veterans Park, with the final numbers still to be determined as part of the bid process.
Not to exceed how much?
We don't know, because they're going to bid out alternates, which we may or may not choose at the time the bids come back. We're not making a final decision. We're just giving them direction as to the concept we're looking for.
Okay.
So it'd be
Because-
something like not to exceed a number to be determined later.
Well, such a motion would be out of order, but We'll just drop the dollar figure at the moment.
I just need to know. Okay.
It'll come back to you as a contract, and then you have final say on the final figure anyway. So. Anything further? Alderman Wesley.
All right, I just want to make sure I got this clear. We are giving them the direction to do a design phase on B2. Is that the motion on there?
That's correct.
2B, all right, 2B. It used to be called B2.
2.5.
It used to be called B2. All right, so that is a motion to go design with that plan.
The design, and then also we are authorizing, or at least directing staff to proceed with the repairs pursuant to alternate 5. Understanding all of this comes back to you for a final vote when the bids goes out and after the design is completed.
In 2 years.
Okay? Is everybody clear?
Yeah.
Roll call.
Alderman R. Wesley.
Yes.
Alderman Winger.
Yes.
Alderman Lewitton.
Yes.
Alderman Cadella.
Yes.
Alderman Shockey.
Yes.
Alderman E. Wesley.
Yes.
Alderman Coles.
Yes.
Alderman Police.
Yes.
That passes unanimously. Does that conclude your report?
No, Mayor,
Oh, no, I'm sorry, it
nope,
does
I
not.
got one
Never
more
mind.
item, Mayor. I'll obtain a motion to approve the new engineer list that has been presented to us in our packet. That will be my motion on the floor. Do I have I'm sorry.
I'll second.
I'd like to recuse myself.
Anything further on the question? Alderman Cadella?
Is every consultant on this list an engineering consultant?
Actually, there's one planning consultant on here, Planning Resources. Infrastructure Management Services are the people who did our last streets efficiency study, so they're not strictly a civil engineering firm, they're more of a testing company. And then a couple other firms on here, Testing Service Corporation, Professional Service Industries. Those are also material testing firms. Those are not civil engineering consultants.
Something's inappropriate. I think either we take everybody off the list who's not an engineer, or we just rename the list, in my opinion, which I'd be fine with either one of those.
Ms. Dixon?
If the purpose of the list is to have your list of approved engineering consultants, my recommendation is you take off anyone who's not an engineer. If the purpose of the list is to have an approved list of consultants you look to of alternate disciplines, then. Which is fine. If you want to call it approved engineering and related disciplines list. Technical consultants, then you could keep them all.
Well, that's fine. I'll change the motion then.
Shouldn't we keep them separate? I don't know.
You don't have to pick them out.
Do you need 5 minutes to revise the list? All right, without objection, we'll recess for 5 minutes.
Mayor, since we had a motion on the floor, do we strike the motion? Isn't there a motion on the floor, though? The motion was approved the list of
To approve
engineers.
the list of it.
City council meeting back into session. Roll call, please.
Alderman R. Wesley. Because I like you. Alderman Winger. Alderman Lewitton.
Here.
Alderman Cadella.
Here.
Alderman Shockey.
Here.
Alderman E. Wesley.
Here.
Alderman Coles.
Here.
Alderman Police.
Here.
Mayor Johnson is here as well.
Oh,
And
good.
for the record, Alderman Winger has previously recused herself on the next pending item. We had a motion pending, but is there a revised motion, or does the movement wish to amend it?
No, the motion was
Wesley
to
Police.
approve the engineer list in which they just presented. I
You
don't,
revised,
The revised.
shall we call it the list of March 25th, even though it says 23?
okay. I will make a motion to approve the revised list of engineer dated March 25th, 2010.
No.
The movement and seconder agree to that change?
Yes.
Seconder was Alderman Police.
Okay. All right. We have an amended motion before us to approve the revised list of March 25th. Anything further on the question? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries.
Make
Second.
motion, we adjourn?
Actually, we do not want to adjourn yet.
Excuse me.
Does that conclude your report?
Oh, my,
Yes, Mayor.
That brings us to Finance and Administration. Alderman Winger.
nice try, though.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What I'd like to do is first ask Mr. Douthwaite to take us through his most recent proposal and the state of the revenues coming in from Illinois as of March 22nd. Mr. Douthwaite?
Mayor, I call the question.
There's no motion pending, but, so that's out of order, sir. Mr. Douthwaite.
Let me go back to 2 weeks ago when we talked a little bit about the budget at the last meeting. At that time, I informed the council that the state was in arrears in its payments to the city for its income tax distribution from November until that point. I also informed the council that the governor had just unveiled a budget proposal that would cut the city's share of the income tax distribution by a factor of 30%. And I gave you all an estimated worst-case scenario, the worst case being that the state would not honor the IOUs that they had given us for the income tax distribution, and that the legislature would enact the budget with the 30% reduction. And I estimated the amount of money in this fiscal year 2010, that we might lose to be $650,000, and estimated that our 30% cut next year would amount to about $350,000 for a round number of about $1 million. And I asked the council for a couple weeks to come back and give you some alternatives. Last week, Mayor Johnson, Alderman Roy Wesley, Alderman Eugene Wesley, and Alderman Shockey and I went down to Springfield to talk to our legislators, and we inquired about not only the governor's proposed budget, but also the fact that they were in arrears on the income tax distribution. And with respect to the income tax distribution, the Senate Minority Leader told us that their priorities were to pay off Medicare and Medicaid providers first, possibly schools second, and then we might not see any of that distribution until well into this coming calendar year, August to October. And in a conversation with Senator Pankow on Tuesday night, she offered the same kind of forecast. So we walked out of there thinking, well, you know, they're not deadbeats yet because they haven't defaulted, and we can continue to book those IOUs as an asset, as an account receivable, and although it might have a minimal impact on our cash flow, it still shows up on the books as an asset, and until they actually default it and we write it off, we haven't lost any paper money. Wednesday morning at breakfast, while we're talking to a representative from Governor Quinn's office, I got an email from the finance director informing me that we had just gotten our November distribution of $72,000. The distribution that the minority leader and our state senator had projected wouldn't come in until later this year. And in a subsequent conversation with the comptroller's staff, the mayor learned that the December distribution of about $56,000 ought to get to us sometime next week. So I guess the bottom line in all this is I don't know whom to believe down in Springfield. We also had a meeting with the House Majority Leader, a Democrat, who informed us that in her opinion, the governor's proposal in his budget was a, quote, non-starter, end quote. So we don't know really where reality is. We know that our projected worst-case $1 million shortfall has shrunk or will shrink by about $130,000. So instead of a potential $1 million shortfall, we're looking at an $870,000 shortfall, worst case, assuming that the state defaults and the governor's budget goes through. So with that information, I ask my staff to go back and look again at the budget and determine what additional cuts we could make absent any reductions in full-time staffing. And they gave me a summary of reductions, which I've sent to you, and I'm going to call the initial budget Plan A. I'm going to call this summary Plan B for the purposes of discussion. And without getting into layoffs, the staff identified about $550,000 in change in additional cuts over and above Plan A that we can make. So if you take the $557,000 out of Plan A, now we're about $300,000 short. And my recommendation to the council is that you pass Plan A budget. You identify Plan B as items to be held and not funded until we find out what happens with revenue sources and figure out what you're going to do with the final $300,000. One alternative is to take that $300,000 out of the general fund reserve of $10.5 million. Another alternative is to defer or cancel some capital projects, move the money from the capital projects fund into the general fund to close up that $300,000. My recommendation is you pass Plan A, you keep Plan A and the Plan B in the budget, but you direct the city manager not to authorize any of these expenditures until our financial situation improves, until we start getting that money in that the state has owed us, and until we see what actually happens with the governor's proposed budget. Now, Plan B is not without its pain. Plan B involves the zeroing out of our school crossing guards and having either community service officers or police officers handle crossing guard duties. It results in a reduction in our mosquito abatement program. It results in the elimination of our gypsy moth spraying. It results in a reduction in sidewalk maintenance, the elimination of some public works equipment, the elimination of 2 vehicles, the elimination of the District 7 after-school program, and a pretty significant reduction in operating equipment for the police department. It's not a easy budget to swallow, but absent going into personnel other than the crossing guards, it's about the best we could do. Now, at the meeting last week or 2 weeks ago, the council also asked me to cost out the cost savings if we imposed a wage freeze on all of our employees, and that number is about $267,000. They asked me to look at the cost savings if we implemented a 5% across-the-board cut in wages, and that savings is over $600,000, and asked me to look at the possibility or the cost savings of a 20% reduction in wages, and that number is just shy of $1.3 million. And I would point out to you that any of those alternatives would require bargaining with our 3 labor unions. The only part of the labor force that we can impose unilaterally is our non-union people. And then I have discussed this. Several aldermen have called me up about this over the last several days. Several aldermen have suggested that perhaps we might need to take a look at layoffs over and above what I've given you so far. And our staff is in the process of identifying potential layoffs. And we'll have a report to you probably on Monday in terms of if we have to lay people off, here are the people that we can do so with, I don't want to even say minimal pain. The pain will be much more than minimal. So the bottom line, and then I'll answer any questions, I think you ought to pass the budget pretty much as it is. Direct the manager not to authorize any expenditures from this Plan B. Find the $300,000 either in the general fund reserve or by canceling a capital project or two, and pretty much call it a day. Now, the only two issues that you need to be aware of that you have to take action on is that if you go ahead with Plan B, that results in the reduction of crossing guards. And you may decide you don't want to do that, and you want to take 19,000 out of this Plan B and reduce Plan B from 557 to 538,000. And one of the items in our Plan B alternative is is not to continue hiring our contract electrical inspector and to have our existing staff suck it up and handle that in-house. So if we went to Plan B to make that work, we'd have to zero out the crossing guards and zero out that contract inspector. And everything else is just on, in this document right here, Plan B, is on hold until the money starts to flow in, at which point I'd come back to you and say, okay, we've got another 150,000 from the state. Here's a proposed, I'd like you to release 150,000 in these line items so that these guys can have their trucks or whatever. But until we get a better sense of where the state is, we're all walking around in the dark in terms of what may happen. And Mayor, with that, Alderman Winger, with that, I'll answer any questions that you might have.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to continue my report if you don't mind, and then open it up for questions.
Let me give a couple ground rules before we go forward. This open discussion is for non-personnel items, so if you have any personnel comments you want to make, we will have an executive session immediately after we complete the Finance Committee portion of this. And a couple other comments I want to make. I have information I put on your dais tonight. One is by DuPage mayors and managers, a survey of various towns and how the recession has affected them and various cuts that they are going through. And the other one, the more larger one, will take you more time to digest, is a survey of all 6 counties in the metro region, all 272 municipalities, at least those that completed the survey. And it's just a factual presentation of those towns that have made cuts, what they've cut, what they've adjusted, or those towns that haven't done any reductions at all. And one other thing before I go forward, recognize you, Alderman Winger. Mr. Wilson, did you have a presentation you were making at this time too regarding the structural problems that we face, non-state related budgetary problems?
We do have one. I mentioned it to Wally. We didn't know if we wanted to do that on the big screen or because there's no specific positions named. It just
If you're
it just
ready, I think
has-
we can do it on the big screen, sure.
Mayor, he just said there's no names there, so is that personnel numbers?
If I understood him correctly, this is generic and not related to any individual personnel?
correct. Yeah, it's
So
historical.
if we could get
actuals
that
and-
information, and then I'll go to Alderman Winger, and then we'll go through the budget. Yeah. Mr. Wilson?
At a meeting that Chairman Winger, myself, and Manager Douthwaite had with the mayor on Monday, we discussed possible structural issues within the general fund as it relates to personnel costs as a percentage of revenues in the general fund itself. So we went through, and before we start, I just want to give a couple of assumptions that we made on these first couple of slides. For fiscal year 05 through 09, the figures are actuals from the audit reports. The fiscal 10 numbers show what we budgeted and what we're projecting. 11 is what we gave to you close to a month now what Manager Douthwaite is referring to as option A. The personnel costs include salaries, overtime, FICA, IMRF, insurance, and police pension contributions. So it is all rolled up into one thing, since those are all true costs of employing someone. So we go back to fiscal 05 actual. The percentages are total personnel costs as a percentage of revenues. As you can see, in 05 it was around 80%. In 06 through 09 it was down around 64%, and then this fiscal year, next fiscal year, did jump back up a little bit. Back between 05 and 06, that was the full realization of the telecommunications tax going in. So that's why that number dropped down and the revenue figure jumped up pretty significantly. So you can see it was trending fairly steady through the middle of the aughts, but then in the tens, it's shot back up a little bit, primarily due to declining revenues and the incremental costs to the bargaining units. Just the raw data behind those numbers. It is a little bit interesting to note that revenues have increased 3.5 million over that period, and personnel costs have gone up 2.2 million. But again, they are over this fiscal year and the proposed fiscal year starting to erode away again, as they did in the early 2000s. What the mayor wanted us to look at then was if revenues remained flat going forward, and we assumed an average increase in personnel costs, what would that look like? So for the next slide, we held revenues constant at the 2011 figure of 12.1 million and inflated the personnel costs of 9.1 million by 3% annually going forward, just to see how that looked. So if you see in 11 the 75.32, then you can see how it trends up. Now these figures exclude your fixed costs such as your gasoline, your electric, your phone bills, uniform allowance for the unions, things of that nature. Like I said, it does assume that revenues stay constant at the exact same dollar amount. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but for the function of this argument, we did hold those steady per the request and looked at it. Just informationally, we didn't want to run it out too far. In 2021 is when personnel costs would overtake the revenues at the current level, assuming an annual 3% increase in personnel costs. And again, behind that, we just have the raw data showing, sorry, I went the wrong way. Have the raw data there showing the incremental increase every year eroding away at that revenue base, being held steady at the proposed fiscal year's levels. And that's all I got. I think that's what you were, I hope I,
Actually, it's a little more conservative. I am assuming revenue and will go up as well, just not as high a proportion as our personnel costs, the way the contracts are currently structured. That was the point I was trying to make.
sure. And one thing that we looked at when putting the 3% together is the number of people at the top of the range in each of the contracts. Because once they reach the top of the range, it's just a maintenance mode. It's just the COLA that you have to deal with. And especially on the PD side, a large number of the union members there are at the top of the range, so they're just getting the COLAs. And if we're renewing them at what we think we may be renewing them at, that's going to drive that down and moderate the healthcare costs, because the healthcare costs have been coming in lower than we've been anticipating due to some good returns through the pool as a whole. So we pegged 3%. It's kind of a middle of the road conservative number. We can obviously tweak that to anything we want, should we want to go that way. So I wasn't trying to misrepresent what you wanted, but we just had to pick a couple benchmarks and go with it.
Thank you. Alderman Winger?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What I'd like to do is highlight what we do know as of March 22nd, 2010, and that's that the state has paid us the amount of income tax due in November of approximately $72,000. And then assurance by the state's comptroller that our December payment would be paid of $56,000 would be forthcoming. And that would total, that would leave us with approximately $522,000, which would still be unknown for this current fiscal year. And to me, at least, in my view, that money, which may not be realized this fiscal year or may come a year later, 2 years later, unfortunately, we didn't budget for that. So if something like that has to come out of the reserves, I can see that. I mean, it's just something that was unknown at the time of the budget. But what we cannot do is repeat that in the next fiscal year. It just wouldn't be prudent. So what I did is I highlighted, first I looked at the responses from the administration on potential cuts. I'd like to highlight what I agree with and note what I disagree with. And I feel it's going to be somewhat representative of where the council is at in talking with some of the council members, the mayor, et cetera. So hear me out, I'm going to go through it, and I think that this will probably help bring this together, and then ideally there's minimal changes at the end of this. So looking at the potential budget reductions presented, instead of cutting the 500-some thousand, I would be looking at $374,684.50. And starting on the first page of administration, instead of cutting $24,317, my suggestion would be cutting that in half to $12,158.50, and proportionately among the 4 subcategories on that page. Page 2, city clerk. Proposed reduction $1,800. I say cut that in half to $900 reduction. Central services, same thing. Proposal $17,800. I say $8,009, proportionally among the 4 subcategories under central services. Finance, same thing. $3,250 was proposed. I say $1,625, proportionally among the 2 subcategories. Next page, community development. All of the recommendations except for the education and training line item, initially budgeted $6,500, proposal to cut out the $5,000. And quick question, city manager, can you refresh my memory on that $5,000, what that training was for?
No, I can't. I'd have to defer to John Forrest on that.
Okay, then my proposal, are you able to answer then? Okay.
Yeah, that sum was removed from the out-of-town conferences and meetings.
Okay, thank you. So on this page, community development, all proposed reductions would be accepted. Next page, engineering. In this page, all proposed changes would be accepted, totaling $15,000 reduction. Public Works Administration, all changes accepted except safety program, that $7,000 was initially budgeted, $7,000 will remain in the budget. Next page, Public Works, streets. The only thing accepted here is a forestry program, and that's due to the brush pickup elimination. Everything else remains budgeted as is currently. So no other changes accepted other than the $85,000 in the Public Works streets. Next page is the only thing accepted on this page is the $2,000 reduction in education and training for Public Works vehicle maintenance, which means that Public Works storm sewer maintenance all proposed changes are rejected. Next page, Equipment Replacement Fund, Public Works. And in this case, we are looking at the, accepting the $75,000 reduction. Next page, Police. And first category, part-time employment, CSOs or police department, or part-time employment, that's the crossing guards, that's rejected. Next section, explanation, discussion of, the next section, we're looking at I'm looking at accepting all the reductions except for the township social service. That would be rejected. That needs to remain in place as budgeted for. The third section on that page, all proposed reductions are accepted. And then the fourth section on the police page, District 7 after school, that is rejected. That's a program that needs to remain. And the conferences, meetings is accepted for the $620. Next page and last page is the Equipment Replacement Fund in the police department. And both are accepted except for a question on the radar. How many radar purchases would be avoided by the reduction of $26,990? Would we be getting the equipment we need to with respect to radar?
We were actually having 10 units, which would outfit all our cars for standardization. What we looked at was cutting that down to 5 and cannibalizing the remaining units when they do break to bring them back up and keep those operational.
And what dollar amount would the 5 equate to? Is it a $10,000
I think it was about
thing?
10 grand.
Okay. Okay, then for the police operating equipment, initially I thought to accept the $26,990, but I'm going to say accept $16,990 instead of $26,990. And that essentially goes through the budgets, and it comes to about $374, $684.50, but I just added in another 10, so we're off by about 10,000 in that figure. And thirdly, what I want to go through in my report is that if I add up 374 plus the other items I'm about to discuss, we're going to get pretty close to $1 million and still have flexibility to revisit probably mid-year. The other two suggestions here would be looking at, in the proposed budget, there is a public works building improvements. The line item is $443,000. Even if we cut that in half and plan on doing $220,000 this fiscal year, that would leave open $220,000. And secondly, we've been looking at doing the curtain wall City Hall improvements for about $350,000. The suggestion would be put that on hold, defer, because if the state does start paying and revenue starts coming in, that's something that we can add back in. So my suggestion there would be cutting out about $350,000 for City Hall improvements, as well as about $220,000 of public works building improvements. Which, when I add that up, let's see, I have 570 plus another 370, so we're close. And that is my recommendation and report. Thank you.
Is that your motion?
That is my motion.
Is there a second? Well, usually we have a motion on the floor to have a debate. If you want to have a discussion on the item, normally we have a motion on the floor.
You have a motion on the floor, right?
So far I have a first. I don't have a second as of yet. All right, hearing none, the motion fails. Alderman Wesson.
Mayor, we could solve this whole problem tonight, right now. You said your budget deficit, if we don't get any money from the state, is 700 and some thousand. Am I correct?
Well, then you have to add on to that, then Governor Quinn's proposed reduction as well of
Oh.
another 310 or 20,000.
That's fine.
If we don't get any money from the state the rest of this fiscal year, if they essentially default on what they've given us IOUs for, and if the governor's budget is accepted, we've got about an $870,000 hole.
Okay. We go back and look at the CIP projects. I went back and I pulled out the CIP book this week, and